Well, good morning, everybody. I am going to use this, just if nothing else, to hide my shaking knees. This made perfect sense yesterday. It doesn't this morning, but nevertheless, it is always good to be with you. But I'm really glad I don't have to do this every week. When I was first asked to do this talk on the topic of progressive evangelism, quite a few months ago, I honestly thought the guy was having a laugh. And perhaps unlucky for you, he wasn't. So the last few months, I've been kind of musing over this topic. So much of what follows is a result of those musings, reflections, and what's kind of come up for me as I've contemplated this topic. So it's a bit more personal, perhaps, than theological. And considering I'm not a theologian, perhaps that's a good thing. So as many of you know, each month we choose a topic to examine. Each month we choose a different topic to examine in depth. So this month we've been looking at different aspects of what evangelism could mean, and perhaps trying to reclaim the word somewhat. You know, many of I don't know. When I was researching this, I came across a wonderful cartoon that had this picture of a face going, "Not evangelism." It was hysterical, but that's kind of the reaction many of us have. And what does it mean in our context today? And the aspect I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the role creating sacred space has in evangelism. And that it was perfect, that hymn, about creating a space where all can be. Now, some of you may recall that the last time I spoke, I actually used the same gospel reading. Now, this reading's become a little bit of a touchstone for me over the last year since a retreat I did in October. James Allison, the controversial but rather fabulous Catholic theologian, once said at a talk I attended, "I only have one idea, and it's not original. However, this gives me half an idea more than many people." I think I feel very much the same way. But I'll come back to that reading shortly. There's also a great deal of irony that I'm speaking on this topic. Here I am, a gay man, theologically woolly, read heretical, liberal, who returned to faith about 8 years ago, and I'm still rediscovering what faith means in a post-evangelical context. If my 20-year-old Pentecostal self could see me now, he simply would not believe it. Not to mention the 24-year-old self who walked away from his church community of his youth, swearing never to set foot in a church building again for the rest of his life. Yet here I am now, employed by the Diocese of Liverpool in their church growth team, leading Open Table, an outreach to the LGBT community, and I'm being considered for a role of local missional leader, whatever that means, or in tech speak, WTF, perhaps. I'll explain that for others who don't quite know it later.
Why, that's fabulous.
And thinking about it, I've probably been more successful in evangelising about my vegetarianism than I have about my faith. Yet I find that I've thrown myself into this role with energy. I find it energising. I've discovered a passion for working within this church community of St Bride's to help it grow. So what is that about? So let's go back a step. What is evangelism? So the dictionary defines it as the spreading of the Christian gospel by public preaching or personal witness, or zealot advocacy of or support of a particular cause. So we can be evangelical about a lot of things, and I think I am somewhat about my vegetarianism. But this public preaching or personal witness, and the personal witness is the bit I want to focus on. Now, the origin of the word evangelism comes from the Greek word evangelion, and the Greek scholars will probably correct that amongst me, but the pronunciation. But the Greek word originally meant a reward for good news given to the messenger. The ev meant good, and the gelion meant I bring a message. The word angel is of the same root, and it later evolved into meaning good news. So, well, what's not to like? Who doesn't like giving good news? Or, as Ruth spoke on last week, being good news. This thing sounds like a great thing to do. However, if we're going to be bearers of good news, we need to be clearer on what that good news is. Now, I don't know about you, but as I was growing up, the good news was that God had tortured and killed his only child to keep me out of the fiery depths of hell for all eternity, and I'd better be grateful and watch my step, because at any moment I could slip up and I'll find myself in eternal torment. Perhaps that's a parody, but as in all parodies, there was an element of truth about it. So this brings me back to the gospel reading I chose today. Now, as an aside, the word gospel comes from the Old English word God's spell, which also means good news or glad tidings. Now, this passage has become one of my favourite scripture verses. Now, this is saying something because I struggle with scripture sometimes, and I'm still learning to re-engage with it. Yet at this passage, I think we hear the very core of the Christian message. And I'm going to use a slightly different translation than the one we read this morning, but in another translation it says, "You are my beloved child. In you I am well pleased." God said this to Jesus before he'd done anything. This was at the very beginning of his ministry. Now, so the heart of the message for me is that you, and you, and you, and even me are made in the image of God. Fearfully and wonderfully made, as the psalmist puts it. A beloved child of God in whom he delights is another translation of that passage. And in Ephesians 2:10, there's the Jerusalem Bible, the Catholic Bible, translate that passage that says that we are God's work of art. But can we actually let those words sink in? I find it hard. But notice what it doesn't say, though. It doesn't say that we're perfect, that everything's going to be okay, or that we're all going to have it all together. No, just that we're loved. Now, I don't know about you, but that is bloody good news to me. And good news that I can scarcely let myself believe. However, as with many things, it's also fundamentally challenging. Because if that is what I am, and that is what you are, a beloved child of God, it has far-reaching ramifications on how I treat you and how you treat me, and how we treat every other human being on the face of this planet. Pope Francis, in an interview last year with the La Repubblica newspaper, said that agape, the love of each one of us for the other, from the closest to the furthest, is in fact the only way that Jesus has given us to find the way of salvation. Now, I only glimpse the possibility of this truth, but this truth is a journey of discovery, and journeys need companions. That's why I go to church. Each of you, in one way or another, are also travelling on the road to discover this truth, that you are loved and you are made in the image of God. And this journey transforms us as we discover who we are. As we often sing at the communion table, take me as I am, and summon out what I shall be. That is what church is, or perhaps should be for. A place of journey together into the mystery that is a God of love, and to who we can become. So, that's what I think the good news is. And good news, we want to share it. So how do we do that? Now, I grew up with an image of evangelism that meant knocking door to door or standing on the street corners proclaiming the gospel of Christ. And that image still makes me shudder. Perhaps a better word for that is proselytism. And I'm going to quote Pope Francis again. Trust a Jesuit to stir things up. But he was quoted in saying in the same newspaper that I quoted before that proselytism is solemn nonsense. It makes no sense. We need to get to know each other, listen to each other, improve our knowledge of the world around us. Sometimes after a meeting I want to arrange another one because new ideas are born and I discover new needs. This is important, to get to know people, listen, expand the circle of ideas. The world is crisscrossed by roads that come together and move apart. But the important thing is that they lead towards the good. I believe that our goal is not to proselytise, but to listen to needs, desires, disappointments, despair, hope. We must restore hope to young people, help the old, be open to the future and spread love. Be poor among the poor. We need to include the excluded and preach peace. So if we really glimpse the truth that we are loved and transformed by that experience, we'll naturally want to share this news. Now, all this may sound somewhat idealistic, and I'm afraid I am somewhat idealistic. Yet for those of you who know me well, they also know that I retain quite a deep cynicism. Hence, for me, a need for companions, as I mentioned before, as we explore this profound love amidst the messiness and tragedies of real life. The good news of love must be realistic and speak to real life, or else it's a fairy tale which perhaps we shouldn't tell anymore. It has to be real. Now, Gerard Hughes, another Jesuit, I think, in his book God of Surprises, was quoted to say, "The only person who can tell you about God is God." And this quote struck me in a very profound way, and it stuck with me for many years. I read the book quite a few years ago now. So if this is true, then one of the ways in which we can share our good news is by creating sacred space. Which is kind of what I've been I tend to do with Open Table. So why creating space? We need to create sacred spaces and sacred communities which provide people the opportunity to hear God say to them, "You are my beloved child." Notice the way I said that around. Not to tell them, but to provide a space for them to hear God say it to them. But what does sacred mean? Sacred means to be revered, again a dictionary definition, revered due to association with holiness, or from the Latin word sanctum, which means set apart. So sacred space is a time, a location set apart as precious as we seek wholeness. And wholeness is also associated with the word holiness. Now, sacredness means different things to different people. We are all different cultural expectations, learning styles, etc., etc., etc. What works for one may not work for others, hence the need for our diversity. The good news may not change, but the way in which people discover that good news will be diverse. But it's not just about physical space. The community within the space is also sacred. A community in which we can be and become. And most importantly, a community where we can be vulnerable. A community in which we can be real. A common feature of human existence appears to have been throughout the ages the creation of spaces and rituals where we gather to give thanks, to sing our hopes, share our tragedies, to make amends, to share life, and to mark those important passages of our life. So this space is made sacred because of what is shared, not because of something intrinsically special about the space, but it's about what is shared that makes it sacred. And I think we do much the same here each Sunday here at St Bride's and throughout the week in everything that we do. We share our dreams, we share life, we sing our hopes. And through the creation of this space, we discover our value, and most importantly, the value of others, and that we are loved and called to love. This has kind of been part of my journey back into faith. And what drew me back is when I was in Sydney, about 8 years ago, or just over. I was invited to a church called St Luke's in Sydney. And this was about after 8 years I'd refused to set foot in a church. And I got invited to one of the very few, there's only a handful of Anglo-Catholic churches in Sydney Archdiocese. And this church was so far removed from the tradition I grew up in. It was chalk and cheese. And yet this message, this good news that I've been talking about this morning, shone through to me through the darkness that I was in. That experience in September 2006 has set me on a path that I could scarcely imagine. And it's a place I return to every time I return to Sydney. It's such a special place. But there's been other examples that I've experienced and or been a part of since I've been living in Liverpool. There was a project a few years ago in Manchester Pride where a group of us got together and we created something we called Gay Sacred Space, where we hired a barge connected to a nightclub and turned it into a prayer space. It was brilliant. And it was something very sacred. It was set apart. Again, and we had a station there that had a mirror, and underneath the mirror it just said, "Made in the image of God." Just very simple things like that. It was very special. Project called Spectrum of Spirituality that I've been part of, which does an annual interfaith service. Again, each of us from our different faith traditions all coming together with the same message, that we are valued and of value. And then Open Table here at St Bride's, all the prayer meetings, all the different things that we do, they're all geared towards discovering this. Now, these don't have to be church settings either. You know, I don't know if you've ever been to any of the memorial services they have in St John's Gardens. That's become a very sacred space for this city. You watch people the way they honour the Hillsborough Memorial at Anfield Stadium. It's very sacred. And then there's a wonderful community that started in the last 12 months here in Liverpool called the Make Space community. Many of you may know about it. And I just love that concept about making space. And they speak of much the same things. And some of you may be familiar with the concept of thin places. I think it's from Celtic spirituality, am I right? And somehow, it's kind of described somehow that the veil between the divine and us is thinner in these places. And I've experienced that in various places. Loyola Hall was a very special place for me. I could walk through those front gates and I would have felt the presence very strongly. The wonderful little St Bino's Chapel in Pisteth, where we went on pilgrimage last year, when we went to Bardsey Island. Somewhere particularly struck me was the Esheness coastline on Shetland Island when I was backpacking. I was the only person for miles around, and I was about as far away from home as I could possibly get without going up into the Arctic Circle. And it was just extraordinary. But all of these are experiences. They're not us being told this good news. It's about us experiencing this good news. The wonderful Maya Angelou once said, "I believed there was a God because I was told it by my grandmother and later by other adults. But when I found that I knew not only that there was God, but that I was a child of God, when I understood it, when I comprehended that, more than that, when I internalised that, ingested that, I became courageous." And I could just hear Maya Angelou saying it. So how do we create this sacred space where we can experience this good news? Well, I don't have a definitive answer. But what I can recognise are the hallmarks of sacredness. And some of those, to me, include a radical welcome. Not just, well, we'll include you. Come on in. You can come and be like us. No, come and be with us. And we might just be changed because you came in with us. A safe space to be vulnerable. And I tell you what, for me to be vulnerable, it'd have to be very safe. But a safe space to be vulnerable. And sacredness actually involves imperfection in my mind. It doesn't have to be perfect. But it has to be real. A place for ritual and spiritual practice. Rituals have been part of our human experience since Adam was a boy, But they're important. The sharing that ritual and that experience is very important in our human experience. And there's many more things beside. You'll all have your own things that are hallmarks for this sacredness. But by creating this sacred space, the spaces that have these hallmarks, we can discover who we really are and can be transformed by that. This transformation can then make our lives, our homes, our relationships sacred spaces. So in the end, I'm kind of coming back to what Ruth said last week. By creating our sacred spaces in our lives, our homes and our relationships, this is how we can share the good news, by being good news. As simple as that, and as complex as that. But by making our very lives a perhaps messy sign that we are loved and loving. Now, to conclude, I want to share a quote with you from Bishop John Shelby Spong. He's a controversial figure and a bit of a grump by all accounts. But I found his insights and stuff that he shares has shaped my journey profoundly. I first came across this quote. Any of you who've done Living the Question may be familiar with it. That's where I first came across it when I did this program in 2008. And this particular quote leapt out at me from the television and moved me to tears. And I could almost quote it word for word, which is quite an achievement with my memory. But that's how much it stood out to me. And it still does today. And that's why I'm going to play it to you rather than attempt to read it. And I can't deliver it like can't imitate John Shelby Spong. But this short piece sums up for me the call of sharing the good news. So just bear with me. It's not going to work.
Suppose we change our God definition. Suppose we take God out of the sky and strip God of the supernatural power which we have created and placed upon this divine being. And suppose we begin to think of God as a presence at the very heart of life. We have to use words, so I use these words without any sense of investing them with more than their meaning will bear. If God is the source of life, as I believe God is, then God is present in all living things. God is present in you, in me, and in the whole created order. And if God is the source of life, then the only way you worship God is by living. Living fully. Sharing life, giving life away, not being afraid, wandering out of the certain into the uncertain, out of the known into the unknown. If God is the source of love, as I believe God is, then the only way you can worship God is by loving. Not by being right, but by loving. By loving wastefully. The image in my mind is an old sink in the basement that you plug up the drains and you turn on all the faucets and the water overflows the boundaries and goes all over the floor and fills up every crack and cranny, every dirty little space, and never stops to ask whether that crack deserves this living water, whether that crack deserves this love. You love because love is what you have to do, not because somebody deserves the love. You love wastefully. If God is the ground of being, as I believe God is, then the only way you and I can worship God is by having the courage to be all that we can be in the infinite variety of our humanity, whether we are male or female, gay or straight, transgender or bisexual, white or black or yellow or brown, left-handed or right-handed, brilliant or not quite so brilliant. No matter what the human difference is, you have something to offer in your own being. Nobody else can offer what you have to offer. And the only way you can worship God is by daring to be all that you can be and not be bound by the fears of yesterday.
So, go out, live fully, love wastefully, and be all that you can be so that others may do so as well. Amen.